Welcome to this session of the Drilling Optimization course. We are in sub-module 2 of 4, focused on risk management. In this sub-module, we will explore how risks are identified, assessed, and mitigated in drilling operations using both subjective and quantitative approaches. Let's begin with the session objectives. In this sub-module, our learning objectives are clearly defined. First, we will understand the difference between subjective and quantitative risk analysis methods and why each has a role in drilling operations. Second, we will recognize the strengths and weaknesses of intuitive or gut-driven risk assessment and discuss why it can sometimes mislead decisions. Third, we'll learn how to apply quantitative tools that measure probability and severity, giving us a structured way to evaluate hazards. Fourth, we will practice interpreting risk matrices, registers, and hazard analysis and risk control documentation, ensuring we can use them effectively in planning and execution. Finally, we will evaluate the limitations and best practices of risk databases, considering how to balance generic knowledge with field-specific experience. Together, these objectives set the foundation for a structured and reliable approach to risk management. Risk analysis in drilling is the structured process of identifying, assessing, and managing potential hazards that may impact safety, environment, or operational performance. The purpose of risk analysis is not simply to list possible hazards, but to evaluate their likelihood and consequences, and then to design mitigation and prevention strategies that reduce exposure. When we talk about the brain and the gut, we are really describing intuitive risk analysis. This is the natural human tendency to rely on experience, judgment, and instinct when making decisions under uncertainty. In drilling, many experienced personnel have a strong feel for operations and can quickly spot potential hazards. This approach is subjective. It is quick and often effective when time is limited, especially in dynamic drilling environments. It relies heavily on the personal experience, knowledge, and situational awareness of the individual or team. However, there are drawbacks. Intuitive assessments are not always documented, making it difficult to validate decisions or share learnings across teams. They can also be unreliable because personal biases, assumptions, or incomplete information may distort judgment. The key takeaway is that while intuitive methods can provide immediate value, they lack consistency and traceability. In high-risk operations, decisions must be supported with structured, documented processes that can withstand review. As we move forward, we will explore how subjective risk analysis, while valuable, needs to be complemented with quantitative methods. The next slide takes a closer look at how subjective analysis can be influenced by experience, knowledge, and preconceptions. Subjective risk analysis is shaped by three main factors: experience, knowledge, and preconceptions. When these are strong and well aligned with reality, assessments can be quite accurate. For example, a driller who has seen lost circulation events in a particular field may quickly identify warning signs before they escalate. However, there are risks. Experience can sometimes mislead, particularly if it is outdated or based on a limited set of wells. Knowledge gaps can result in missing key hazards, and preconceptions, or mental shortcuts, may distort both probability and severity assessments. This often leads to overestimating how often an event might occur, while underestimating the seriousness of its potential consequences. The outcome is that the wrong preventive or mitigation measures may be applied. Resources might be wasted controlling minor risks, while critical hazards remain under-addressed. The key point is that subjective risk analysis provides valuable insights but must be balanced with more structured approaches. It should never stand alone as the sole basis for decision-making in drilling operations. In the next slide, we'll compare subjective and quantitative methods directly to see where each approach adds value. Subjective and quantitative analysis both play important roles in drilling risk management. Subjective methods rely on personal judgment, experience, and interpretation. They are useful when data is scarce or when location-specific knowledge is more accurate than generic datasets. For instance, a local drilling superintendent may recognize formation instability trends better than a global model. The strength of subjective analysis is its speed and reliance on direct expertise. However, the drilling process is highly complex, with countless interacting variables. This complexity means that subjective assessments can miss key hazards or be overly influenced by preconceptions. Quantitative analysis, on the other hand, uses structured tools to measure likelihood and severity. These tools provide consistency, documentation, and repeatability. They also enable risk to be communicated clearly across disciplines. However, quantitative analysis is limited by the quality of available data. Too little information may make the model simplistic, while too much data may overwhelm the process and introduce new biases. The reality is that risk assessment requires both approaches. Subjective expertise helps fill gaps when offset data is unavailable. Quantitative tools bring discipline, traceability, and structure. In the next slide, we'll explore how subjective assessments can be improved by quantifying them through structured processes. To improve subjective analysis, we need to find ways to quantify it. This means converting gut feeling and experience into structured data points that can be captured, compared, and reviewed. The risk assessment process allows us to do exactly that, by formalizing subjective inputs into probability, severity, and consequence frameworks. One important concept here is Bayes' theorem. In plain terms, Bayes helps us update our understanding of probability as new information becomes available. For example, if we initially estimate the likelihood of stuck pipe as low, but later receive offset data showing multiple recent events, Bayes allows us to revise that probability upward in a logical way. It is also essential to focus on root causes rather than consequences. If we only treat the outcome, such as lost circulation, without understanding its underlying geological or operational cause, our mitigation may not prevent recurrence. By quantifying subjective analysis, we combine human expertise with structured methods, resulting in better decisions and more reliable risk evaluations. This leads us naturally to the next section, where we look at the framework of quantitative risk assessment tools in greater detail. Quantitative risk assessment is designed to bring structure and consistency into hazard evaluation. Although different designs exist, the underlying principles are similar. The process begins with defining the task or activity. This ensures the scope of the assessment is clear. Next, we identify the hazard elements, the potential sources of danger. For each hazard, we assess the probability of occurrence and the severity of its consequences if it materializes. Once these are defined, we design mitigation measures to reduce the severity and prevention actions to lower the probability. We also identify possible contingency actions that address what happens if controls fail. The result is a residual risk value, which reflects the level of risk after mitigation and prevention are applied. This allows teams to decide whether the risk is acceptable, requires further action, or is intolerable. The key advantage of this approach is that it documents analysis and supports hazard control through structured understanding and design. In the next slide, we will expand on the benefits of quantitative methods and how they can be applied at both broad and detailed levels. Quantitative risk assessment offers several clear advantages over purely subjective approaches. First, it allows us to quantify subjective judgments. Instead of leaving a risk assessment as a verbal opinion, it becomes a documented and measurable record. Second, analysis is fully documented. This ensures decisions can be reviewed, audited, and improved over time. Documentation also supports knowledge transfer across teams, which is critical in multinational drilling operations. Third, quantitative assessment improves hazard mitigation. By clearly defining risks, we can design targeted prevention actions that reduce probability and mitigation measures that limit severity. This structured process avoids wasting resources on ineffective or unnecessary controls. Another key benefit is the ability to define unacceptable risks. By setting thresholds, we ensure that certain hazards cannot be ignored or overlooked. Quantitative tools can also be applied flexibly, either at a high level, across an entire operation, or for a single hazard that requires detailed evaluation. Taken together, These advantages demonstrate why quantitative tools are essential in modern drilling risk management. In the next slide, we will look at a practical example of this method in action. This illustration shows a HARC, Hazard Analysis and Risk Control Record, which is SLB's structured tool for assessing and documenting risk. Let's walk through it step by step from left to right. We begin with activity steps, where each phase of the operation is broken down. This ensures hazards are tied directly to specific tasks, rather than being assessed in isolation. Next, under hazard, we describe the potential threat and its worst-case consequence if no prevention or mitigation measures are in place. Alongside, the loss category or population affected specifies who or what could be harmed, for example, personnel, the environment, or equipment. The initial risk section contains 3 subcolumns: likelihood, severity, and overall risk level. These values reflect the risk profile before any controls are applied. Likelihood represents the probability of occurrence, severity measures the potential impact, and risk level combines the two. We then move to control measures, where both current and planned prevention measures are listed to reduce likelihood, and mitigation measures are identified to reduce severity. This ensures controls address risk from both sides, probability and consequence. Finally, the residual risk section recalculates likelihood, severity, and overall risk after controls are applied. This provides a clear before and after comparison, showing whether risk has been reduced to an acceptable level. By working systematically across the HARC, teams can ensure hazards are identified, controls are documented, and residual risks are minimized. Now let's look at a real example. This HARC example is for a drilling of surface hole section, running and cementing 13 3/8 inch without the diverter installed. Let's focus on the first activity step, drilling the surface hole section with a directional BHA without a diverter installed on surface. Starting at the left, we see the hazard description identifies the risk of fire or flammable events, specifically hydrocarbons flowing from the lower FARS or GAR formation. Without a diverter, which normally channels unexpected flow away from the rig floor, the consequences could escalate quickly. The loss categories listed are personnel, assets and reputation, emphasizing the impact on safety, equipment integrity, and the operator's standing. Looking at the initial risk values, the likelihood is rated as low, meaning such an event is not expected frequently, but the severity is major, reflecting that if it does occur, consequences could be significant. Together, these produce a medium risk level. Control measures are divided into prevention and mitigation. Preventive actions include using diverters on the first pad well, employing mud logging to detect gas, monitoring mud levels, ensuring proper weighting materials are available, and designing cement programs to strengthen barriers. These reduce the likelihood of an incident. Mitigation measures, such as pumping high-density fluid at high rates, activating the emergency response plan, keeping fire pumps and certified supervisors on site, and conducting regular well control drills, reduce severity if an event occurs. The risk level moves from medium to low with all the procedures put in place. Now let's look at how we define likelihood and severity. The residual risk after controls shows a very low likelihood combined with major severity, producing a low risk level overall. This demonstrates how structured controls successfully reduce exposure to an acceptable level. By working through this row, we can see how HARC translates hazards into actionable preventive and mitigation strategies. This slide introduces a quantitative risk matrix. Along the vertical axis, we see severity ranging from light incidents to catastrophic and multi-catastrophic outcomes. Along the horizontal axis, we see likelihood, from improbable events to those considered probable. Each cell of the matrix represents a different combination of severity and likelihood, resulting in a defined risk level. Color coding helps communicate the significance. Red indicates intolerable risks which must not be accepted under any circumstances. Yellow represents undesirable risks which require justification and demonstration of a LARP, as low as reasonably practicable before proceeding. Green shows acceptable risks where we may proceed carefully. always seeking continuous improvement. Finally, blue marks negligible risks that are considered safe to proceed. A white arrow on the chart highlights how risk decreases as likelihood and severity are controlled. The matrix provides a clear visual tool for making decisions. It defines where operations can proceed, where mitigation must be strengthened, and where activities must stop. By standardizing how probability and severity are defined, risk matrices improve consistency across teams. Next, we will explore risk registers, which serve as databases for capturing and managing this information across multiple projects. A risk register is a structured database that captures and organizes detailed quantitative risk data. Registers can be developed at the local level, specific to a field or operation, or they can be maintained globally across an organization. The key advantage of a risk register is accessibility. Data can be quickly retrieved, reviewed, and applied to new projects, reducing duplication of effort. Each entry should include not just the hazard and its quantified risk, but also the prevention and mitigation measures that were applied. This creates a living record of lessons learned and ensures that successful strategies can be reused. Registers also allow organizations to track risk trends over time. They can highlight recurring hazards, show the effectiveness of controls, and inform where improvements are needed. However, as we'll see in the next slide, there are some limitations to risk registers that must be managed. By introducing risk registers, we bridge the gap between individual project assessments and organizational knowledge sharing. Now let's look at the challenges and potential limitations these registers can create. While risk registers provide value, they also have limitations that need to be carefully managed. First, administration. Building and maintaining a detailed database requires significant time and effort. Without proper updates, registers can become outdated, leading to misleading or incomplete information. There is also a risk that certain hazards may be overemphasized simply because they are better documented, while other critical risks may be overlooked. Second, generic content. A global register cannot always account for the variability of local conditions. What is considered a high priority hazard in one field may not apply in another. Registers should therefore act as baselines, not as replacements for site-specific risk analysis. To maximize value, registers must be continuously updated and integrated with local field knowledge. This ensures they remain accurate, relevant, and practical. Teams must also be trained to use registers as decision support tools, not as check-the-box exercises. In summary, registers are powerful, but only when managed properly. They must balance global consistency with local accuracy. In the next slide, we will revisit the module objectives to review how these concepts have been addressed throughout this session. Let's conclude by reviewing the objectives of this submodule. We began by distinguishing between subjective and quantitative risk analysis methods, showing how each has strengths and weaknesses. We then examined intuitive, gut-driven assessments, recognizing both their speed and their limitations. Next, we explored quantitative tools, learning how probability and severity can be measured, documented, and managed through risk matrices, registers, and HARC documentation. We also addressed the limitations of subjective assessments and demonstrated how structured processes, supported by concepts such as Bayes' theorem, can help quantify experience-based judgments. Finally, we looked at risk registers, highlighting both their benefits for knowledge sharing and their challenges in administration and relevance. Each of these objectives has been met, giving us a well-rounded understanding of risk management tools and practices in drilling operations. This concludes Submodule 2 of 4 on risk management. Thank you for your attention and engagement throughout this session. Please proceed to the quiz to test your knowledge and reinforce the key points we've covered. Your participation is valued, and I look forward to building on these concepts in the next module. Thank you.